So as a priest, I am constantly astounded by the amount of suffering people go through. I'm obviously in this privileged position of hearing people's stories and meeting people at very vulnerable moments of their life. And it just never ceases to amaze me. People who on the surface seem to be completely living the dream. You know, that their lives look like something you would envy. But when you scratch the surface enough, you realize that they carry this whole world of pain inside of them. And even when you see people who look like they're struggling, when you actually sit down and ask the story, you realize that you're barely seeing the tip of the iceberg on the surface. You know, there's been times where I've walked away from talking to someone just thinking, how on earth are you still smiling? You know, the stuff you carry within yourself. And I think this is important to realize, that this is a universal thing. All of us are very good at pretending, particularly when we come to church. You know, we put on a brave face and pretend that our families are perfect. And we almost feel ashamed because we think we're the only ones that are going through this. I suggest you look around and realize that every person in this church is going through the same thing you're going through. This is a universal human thing. And the reality is that we often bury this stuff so deep that we are in denial of it ourselves. We live our lives with so many coping mechanisms. We restrict our lives so that we never go near the source of the hurt, and yet it dominates our life. The gospel today, Jesus is trying to speak a very powerful word about the fact that this is not the way it's meant to be. We are not meant to experience this sort of suffering. It was never God's plan. As we heard in the first reading, it was really as a result of sin entering the world. Or as it says, it was as a result of the devil's envy that all of this came into the world. Jesus' intention is to bring restoration so that we can come back into the fullness and freedom of life. Now, we need to understand a couple of things here. Death is the ultimate healing. That probably sounds a little bit confronting, but it is. That the healing we crave, the freedom we look for, will not truly be experienced until we enter into the promised land. And we need to realize that that is the life that we have been made for. We have not been made for this world here. This world is temporary. And as much as we desperately try to cling on to it, we need to realize that we will not experience the fullness of healing until we enter into eternity. Now that kind of puts things in a bit of perspective. Because when we talk about healing, there's two different sides here. There's physical healing and there's internal healing, emotional, spiritual, psychological healing. Physical healing happens. I've seen many people healed. And this is something which we should pray in faith for. But it's important to realize that physical healing is temporary. So in the gospel today, the daughter of this synagogue official is healed. She is raised from the dead. She, later in life, died again. In the same way, when Lazarus is raised from the dead, he went on and died a second time. He had to pay for 2 funerals. Not very convenient. And this is the reality, that any time we experience physical healing, the very nature of our body is that it is on this trajectory towards decay. You know, so whatever we are healed from will eventually continue to break down, and we will die. And we've got to kind of get used to that idea. There is something deep in our hearts which rages against God because we hate the idea of death. You know, I've met so many people who have given up on God because they prayed for their grandmother to be healed, and their grandmother died. And it speaks of something where we're not reconciled with death. We are still hoping against hope that somehow we can live for eternity here on earth. And we forget the fact that he died on the cross so that we could live for eternity in heaven. So there's a place where God works physical healing as a promise of the eternal healing. Whenever Jesus heals someone in the Gospels, he's trying to point to the fact that he holds the power to restore everything in heaven. And so if you have experienced physical healing, you are meant to be a witness to the power of God to reveal that hope to the world. And so that's just important to remember all the time. Now, as I said, physical healing is one side of the story. The internal healing, the emotional, the psychological, the spiritual, that is permanent. So whereas the body continues to break down, there is a healing which God wants to do to our souls, which is everlasting. And I think this is actually the most important side of the story. All of us carry areas of deep, deep hurt and brokenness inside of ourselves. One of the things I find fascinating is that when people are physically ill, they are desperate to pray for God's healing. But when they are emotionally unwell, they bury it. And they almost feel ashamed to ask for help. It should be the other way around. Because the thing that really cripples us is the emotional stuff. That's the stuff that has the biggest impact on your family. That's the stuff that causes this ripple effect down through generations. That's the area which Jesus wants to reach in and heal. And if I dare say, I think sometimes God allows physical suffering so that we can become aware of the internal emotional suffering. You see, sometimes we are so blind and oblivious to the real hurt. It's only when you get the bad diagnosis from the doctor and suddenly all that stuff comes up to the surface. That's the area which he really wants to deal with. Now, every one of us experiences that in different ways. For some, it's come from family trauma. From some, it's come from where people have hurt you. From others, it's just simply the fact that the human soul is damaged. The very nature of what sin has done to us means that we are all kind of twisted up in some way. We need to reach out to Jesus, trusting that he wants to heal that. As this woman in the gospel who was so deeply ashamed of her ailment, and yet she had so much faith to reach out in the crowd and touch the garment of Jesus. And that faith was what caused the healing. Jesus speaks in so many times that he honours the faith of those who reach out boldly. We need to come to a place where we are no longer hiding in shame. We're no longer just trying to cope or manage our brokenness. But we come to a place of saying, Lord, I believe that you want this to be healed. I believe that you want me to experience the fullness of life. And if that means being healed of these burdens, these traumas, these hurts, I need you to reach out and do some work in my life. That requires an enormous faith. And it also requires a great perseverance. And this is the important thing to understand. When Jesus teaches us how to pray in Luke chapter 18, he uses the story of the widow who goes to try and get justice from the local judge. And he closes the door on her. And so instead of walking away, she bangs on the door and says, give me justice, give me what I need. And every day, every night, she is there making sure that this guy can't sleep until she gets what she wants. And Jesus says, that's how I want you to pray. Now, this is a strange thing because we kind of presume that if God loves us, he's going to give us what we want straight away. But what he's trying to do here is he's trying to say there is a process of asking which is actually key to the healing. It's in the perseverance of asking for healing. Firstly, your motivations start to change. Initially I want to be healed just so I can go and have a good holiday and enjoy my life. But the more that I start asking for it, the more I realize that I actually need this for a deeper reason. But there's also something where in the process of asking, I actually go deeper in self-awareness to realize how deep this actually goes. Sometimes I'm only aware of the surface layer of the hurt. But the more I ask, the more I start to recognize how the roots of this infiltrate everything. And so that prayer of asking actually goes deeper. And I'm praying not just to take away the pain, I'm asking for him to transform my whole way of thinking, to start to change my whole sense of identity. And so we need to really cry out in faith, but trust that he's taking us on a journey of self-discovery in the midst of that process of healing. Now, we as Catholics have such a unique experience when we come to the Mass because we receive Jesus physically into us. As this woman reached out to touch him physically and said, Lord, I need your healing. As you receive Jesus in the Eucharist, to realize that that is the same encounter and to invite him into those areas of your deepest pain. And do it with faith. Do it with that childlike faith that just expects that he's going to come and do that work. Now, some of you may have heard me tell this story before, but many years ago, I was very early on in my conversion, and I'd attended this week-long retreat. I had great expectations that this retreat was going to change my life, and I was sick for most of the week. I'd eaten something bad, and I couldn't sleep, and I couldn't focus in anything. Anytime I was sitting in the sessions, I was just wanted to crawl up in the corner and die. I was feeling so bad. But I kind of persevered, and I got to the final day of the retreat, at the final Mass. And by this point, I was just so over it, I didn't care. But after I'd received Jesus in the Eucharist, I went back to my chair, and it was this prayer, almost just joking with God. I just said, look, Jesus, I've just received you in the Eucharist. You're on the way down towards my stomach right now. Can you do something to fix it? And I didn't even take the prayer seriously. But 5 minutes later, I walked out of the church and I realized I felt fantastic. I thought, oh, hang on. He answered that prayer. But it was such a realization that that's the power of the Eucharist. And for me to pray for something so trivial, it made me wake up and realize, hang on, I should be praying for the serious stuff now. So I want to encourage you as we receive the Eucharist today to reach out and cry that he would bring that healing to you.